are similar but not the same, depending on who you read. But what we really have to address is this issue of what is a personality, and what do we do with these people who present, or at least tell us, that they have these changes where they are amnestic and they go around doing things, and people walk up to them and say, "Hi, Bob," and the guy's name's not Bob, and the guy acts like he's had a relationship with Bob and he's his best friend, but he doesn't know who the guy is, and this happens like twice a month. And chronic mistaken identity experiences, chronic amnestic episodes. What do people do when this is kind of your life? How do people deal with that? What would you do if you walked around and had those kind of experiences on a fairly regular basis? What would you do with it? And don't say I'd go get therapy, because that takes 7 years. What would you do in the meantime?
You avoid meeting people?
Yeah. You'd try to minimize the risk that this is going to happen, and you would hide it. You would develop a cover story. And when you really get into talking to people who are suffering from this, what they'll tell you is they have a lot of conversations where they look like they're agreeing and have no idea what the other person's talking about. When somebody's talking about an experience they shared, they're like, "Oh yeah, that really was great." No idea what the person's talking about. And they're believable. They develop a way of hiding their symptoms. All of them. All of the symptoms of dissociation can be concealed. It's internal. So they won't come out and tell you this. If you ask the question, they'll look at you like, "How did you know?" And they might acknowledge it. But it's Rick Clough calls it a pathology of hiddenness. Why do we hide things? Shame. We're ashamed of it. That's one of the reasons. So then you have to deal with, do I work with these different parts of the person or not? Do I work with whatever we want to call them? We don't like personality anymore. They used to be called alters, right? That's probably technically the term alter personality. But a lot of us don't like using that anymore, at least not writing it in a chart. What do we call them now? We just change the name. Self-state. That's what we document. Self-state. That's kind of vague. That works well. But what are we really talking about? A subjective sense of yourself that's different, that is not fluid, that is not consistent across time and across situations. That's really the heart of what this is. And it's embedded in amnesia. So the question is, when these people report these different personalities, do we work with them or not? There's a school of thought that says you should suppress all of this and don't talk about it and it'll go away. There really is a group of people that believe you cannot interact with a person with this framework in mind. What do you think? How would you do it? You don't have to decide right now, because you're not going to see your first client with this till Thursday. So.
Integration is good?
I think so. What's integration? When we talk about DID, what's integration? It's working toward losing the subjective division of self and of memory. So different people call this different things. When we talk about integration, that's the name for the ongoing process, which is really neat, because for those of you who like the old psychodynamic literature, that concept has been around forever, not related to this, but related to just how defenses change over time with psychotherapy. This isn't new. This is actually really old. It's kind of cool. If you're going to do that work, then you probably sort of have to have a framework in your mind of what you believe about what this represents. And a lot of us think of that the states are differential adaptations to trauma. That's all they are. They're the way the person coped with something overwhelming in an intrapsychic way. And essentially, in fantasy, they created an alternate identity. The most common alternate identity is something called isomorphic alter. What does isomorphic mean? It's the same. The only difference is one aspect of the identity does not have amnesia, one does. So the person who has 12 different names, and one day they look like a little girl, and the other day they look like a man, and that's unusual. That is not how this looks, typically. So when you see that, again, you have to answer why. Work on therapeutic alliance is crucial. We don't expect the client to ever really trust fully until well toward the end of the therapy. That's part of the deal with doing this kind of work with somebody who's been traumatized that much. If they do, that's awesome. But I think it's good to talk to them about mistrust early on, and that you're okay with them mistrusting you. You got to give permission for them to relate to you that way and see what it does. Ground rules, meaning how are we going to keep this a safe process? You know, ground rules are really simple, but you have to have your own that you're comfortable with. Mine are: you don't hurt me, you don't hurt yourself in the office. If you're going to act out, like throw furniture or whatever, you should get up and leave before you do that. Just real simple stuff. Oh, you should show up and probably pay too. But real simple ground rules. But what's really important is to be concrete and not ambiguous in your expectations. Okay. Why? Because that can trigger associations to traumatizing individuals. Because again, what's one of the dynamics of trauma? That the rules were not what they were supposed to be. The perpetrator was okay violating the rules. So if your rules aren't tight, and if you don't hold yourself to a high standard, the potential for that to replicate or start a process of reenactment is there. And then you're in it. You're in a flashback together. We also do a lot of psychoeducation around PTSD and a lot of homework. A lot of homework. Why? Because it's somebody who has trouble with continuity of memory. What do you think happens when they leave the session?
They forget.
Amnesia. It's a wonderful thing. We can have the same conversation 15 times, and if we don't do something active to help keep it alive in between, we can have the same conversation 15 times. So what do? Things like journaling, having people write about specific things we talked about, having conversations, with other people about things that we talked about, but some kind of therapeutic assignment. We also obviously focus a lot on dangerousness with any kind of trauma. And looking at the cognitive distortions that really drive a lot of the symptoms are important, particularly the distortions around expectation of danger, expectation of repetition of trauma. Specific techniques for working with dissociative self-states. Again, we can't do this justice, but there are ways to work with the different self-states that are not suggestive and not leading. Okay? There's training that's available for that. One, the idea that you relate to, one key concept is that no matter how the person experiences themselves, you have to respect that and honor that, but also treat them as a single human being who is responsible for his or her behavior, regardless of whether they're amnestic for it or not. And until the client buys into that notion, it's going to be hard to get better. I tell people that. I appreciate that you don't remember what you did. I'm asking you to appreciate that you're still responsible for it anyway. And you hold people to a high level of responsibility in the therapy for behavior, even if it's done in amnesia. And they'll say, well, that's not fair. No, it's not. But unfortunately, do you want fair or do you want healing? You get to decide which it's going to be, because this is how you heal. You accept responsibility for your behavior and for your symptoms, essentially. And we're going to work on that. We'll work on how to make it better. But until people, there's a lot of behavior that really gets therapeutically justified, and that tends not to go well. If you let people off the hook for things they do under the influence of different self-states, people tend not to get too better. Especially if that behavior is criminal. So you want to be really mindful of that. Do not tolerate criminal behavior because that other part of it did it. Just don't do it. Mapping the dissociative surface, that means the person's internal experience of themselves, having to put it on paper and see what it looks like. And then teaching grounding and containment skills. Grounding means helping the person orient in the moment in a sensory way. So look around the room, describe what you see, put your feet on the floor, hold on to something when the person feels like they're dissociating, leaving their body. Let's do things to bring your attention back into the present moment. So any kind of mindfulness-based intervention helps a person terminate a dissociative state. That's the goal, to be in the here and now, which is the opposite of dissociative. When a person's in flashback in your office, and they're in that kind of dissociative state, I'll ask people to look around the room and describe things in the room that were not a part of their trauma. See that orange chair? Was that there when you were being